The dust-laden wind carried the distant echoes of a town once alive with promise, as Matthew Irwin galloped toward the horizon, unaware that this day would forever divide his life into before and after. The setting sun painted the Montana sky in hues of amber and crimson, silently foreshadowing the flames that would soon consume everything he held dear. It was 1876, and the small cattle town of Jerome, Montana, was experiencing its first taste of prosperity after the railroad had finally reached its borders the previous spring. Matthew, at 28, had built himself a respectable ranch 5 miles outside of town, the culmination of 8 years of backbreaking work since arriving out west with nothing but determination, and the skills his father had taught him back in Pennsylvania. The Rocking Eye Ranch wasn't the largest spread in the territory, but it was his, free and clear. His herd had grown steadily each year, and he just completed construction on a proper 2-story house to replace the humble cabin where he'd spent his first years on the property. Life was unfolding exactly as he'd planned it. As Matthew approached his homestead, he noticed an unusual plume of smoke rising against the darkening sky. His gut twisted with immediate recognition that something was terribly wrong. The smoke was too thick, too dark, and rising from precisely where his new house stood. "Hiya!" he shouted, digging his heels into his horse's flanks. The stallion responded instantly, breaking into a full gallop. The scene that greeted him as he crested the final hill stole the breath from his lungs. His newly built home was engulfed in flames, the fire having already consumed most of the first floor and now hungrily devouring the second. The dry wood of the frontier house served as perfect kindling, and the evening breeze only fed the inferno. Matthew threw himself from his horse before it had fully stopped, stumbling forward as his boots hit the ground. The heat was intense even from 50 yards away, but he charged toward the burning structure anyway. "Hello," he shouted. "Anyone around? What happened?" No answer came except the roaring of the flames. His ranch hands would be out with the cattle, but he suddenly remembered his foreman, old Tim Henderson, had been feeling poorly and might have stayed behind. "Tim!" Matthew yelled, circling the house and looking for any sign of the older man. When he reached the back of the house, he spotted a figure lying motionless near the back door. Without hesitation, Matthew rushed to Tim's side. The man was unconscious but breathing, a nasty gash on his forehead suggesting he'd been struck by something. Matthew quickly dragged him further from the house. Tim, can you hear me?" He patted the man's cheek gently. Tim's eyes fluttered open briefly. "Rustlers," he managed to whisper before slipping back into unconsciousness. Matthew's blood ran cold. Cattle rustlers were a constant threat on the frontier, but they rarely attacked homesteads directly. His gaze darted to the barn, which was still untouched by the flames. Inside were important documents, a small safe with his savings, and most importantly, a portrait of his parents, the only image he had of them since their passing. Without thinking, Matthew sprinted toward the barn, even as he heard the ominous cracking of the house's main support beams beginning to give way. He had nearly reached the barn when a thunderous explosion rocked the property. The kerosene stored in the kitchen had ignited. The force knocked Matthew to the ground, and as he scrambled to his feet, he saw that burning debris had landed on the barn's roof, which was already catching fire. There was still time to save what was inside, he thought, as he pushed through the barn doors. The interior was hazy with smoke, but not yet fully engulfed. Matthew rushed to the small office area in the corner, grabbed the lockbox containing his important papers, and then reached for the framed portrait of his parents that hung on the wall. As his fingers closed around the frame, he heard a sickening crack from above. Matthew looked up just in time to see a burning beam break free from the ceiling. He tried to leap backward, but the heavy timber caught him across the shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. Pain exploded through his body, but adrenaline pushed him to his feet. He still clutched the portrait and lockbox, and through the thickening smoke, he staggered toward where he remembered the door to be. The heat was unbearable now, and his eyes burned fiercely. Each breath filled his lungs with acrid smoke. Matthew stumbled, hitting his knee hard against something, but kept moving forward. Just as he felt the night air on his face, another beam collapsed behind him with a thunderous crash, sending up a storm of embers and burning splinters. Something struck the back of his head hard, and at the same moment, a searing pain engulfed his face and eyes as hot embers and burning debris rained down upon him. Matthew screamed, dropping his precious cargo and clawing at his eyes. The agony was indescribable as he fell forward, tumbling out of the barn and down the short set of steps. The cool ground was a momentary relief against his scorched skin, but the pain in his eyes, dear God, the pain in his eyes consumed every thought. Matthew rolled, trying to extinguish any flames that might be burning his clothing, desperately rubbing at his face. His last coherent thought before darkness claimed him was of the portrait, left behind in the inferno, the faces of his mother and father turning to ash along with everything else he'd built. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. First, there was pain, so much pain that Matthew wished for the oblivion again. Then came sounds, the crackling of dying flames, the nickering of horses and voices, unfamiliar voices. "He's still alive," someone shouted. "Get Doc Sanders out here, quick." Rough hands lifted him, and Matthew cried out as his burned skin protested the contact. "Easy, mister, we're trying to help you," a gruff voice said near his ear. Matthew tried to open his eyes but found he couldn't. Panic surged through him. "My eyes," he managed to rasp. "Can't see." "Don't try to open them," the voice commanded. "They're pretty badly burned. Just hold on." Time lost all meaning as Matthew drifted between consciousness and blessed darkness. When awareness returned more fully, he was lying on something softer, a bed, he realized, and the smells around him had changed. Gone was the acrid stench of smoke and burning wood, replaced by the sharp tang of antiseptic and medicinal herbs. "He's coming around," said a voice Matthew recognized as belonging to Doc Sanders, the physician from Jerome. "Can you hear me, Matthew?" the doctor asked, his voice coming from somewhere close by. "Yes," Matthew replied, his own voice sounding strange to his ears. "Why can't I see? Why is everything dark?" There was a heavy pause before the doctor answered. "Your eyes were severely damaged in the fire, son. I've cleaned and bandaged them as best I can, but..." The unfinished sentence hung in the air like a death sentence. "But what?" Matthew demanded, trying to sit up only to be gently pressed back down by firm hands. "The burns are extensive," Doc Sanders continued, his tone professionally detached but tinged with genuine regret. "Particularly to your corneas. I don't want to give you false hope, Matthew." The words struck Matthew like physical blows. "You're saying I'm blind, that I'll never see again?" "I can't say for certain," the doctor replied carefully. "But in my experience, injuries like yours, they don't typically heal in a way that restores sight." Matthew lay silent, the enormity of the doctor's words washing over him like ice water. Blind. The ranch, his cattle, his independence, all of it depended on his ability to see. What was a blind cowboy good for? What life awaited a man who couldn't ride the range, couldn't read the brands on cattle, couldn't even find his way from the house to the barn without help? "The rest of your burns should heal reasonably well," the doctor continued, filling the silence with clinical observations. Your hands protected much of your face when you raised them instinctively. There will be scarring, but it could have been much worse. You were lucky that. Matthew stopped listening. Lucky. The word was a mockery. His home was gone, his livelihood in jeopardy, and his sight possibly lost forever. Luck had nothing to do with what had happened to him. "Where's Tim?" Matthew asked suddenly, interrupting whatever the doctor had been saying. "Your foreman." "He's recovering at Sheriff Taylor's house," Doc Sanders replied. "Nasty bump on the head, but he'll be just fine. Says some men rode onto the property claiming to be lost. When he went to help them, one clubbed him from behind. He believes they set the fire to cover their tracks after robbing you." Matthew's hands clenched into fists. "Did they catch them?" "Not yet," the doctor said. "Sheriffs organized a posse, but those men had several hours head start. Tim couldn't give much of a description, said there were 3 of them, all wearing bandanas over their faces." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of a door opening. "Doc," a woman's voice called softly. "Mrs. Wilson sent over some fresh bandages and that herbal salve you asked for." "Ah, thank you, Katherine," the doctor replied. "Please come in. This is Matthew Irwin." "Matthew, this is Katherine Prescott. She's been helping me in the clinic these past few months." "Madam," Matthew acknowledged stiffly, hating to be seen in such a state, especially by a woman he didn't know. "Mr. Irwin," she replied, her voice gentle but not overly pitying, which he appreciated. "I'm very sorry about what's happened to you." Her footsteps approached the bed, light and measured. The scent of lavender drifted to him, subtle and clean, a stark contrast to the medicinal smells that filled the room. "Katherine is a godsend," Doc Sanders said. "Came out here from Boston about 6 months ago, trained as a nurse back east." "My father was a doctor," Katherine explained. "I assisted him for years before coming west." "What brings a Boston nurse to Jerome, Montana?" Matthew asked, partly out of genuine curiosity, partly to distract himself from his current circumstances. There was a slight pause before she answered. "A change of circumstances," she said simply. "And you, are you a native of Jerome?" "No, madam. Pennsylvania originally. Came out here 8 years ago to make my own way." "And you have," Doc Sanders interjected. "The Rocking Eye is one of the most prosperous smaller spreads in the county." "Was," Matthew corrected bitterly. "Not much left of it now, I imagine." "The house and barn are losses," the doctor confirmed solemnly. "But your cattle are safe. Your hands moved them to the north pasture when the fire started, far from the buildings." Small comfort, Matthew thought, though he was relieved his men had saved the herd. Still, without being able to see, how could he possibly manage a cattle operation? "I'll need to change your bandages now," Doc Sanders said, moving closer to the bed. "Katherine, if you'll assist me." "Of course," she replied. Matthew heard the rustle of fabric as she moved around the bed. The next several minutes were a study in controlled agony as the doctor carefully removed the bandages from Matthew's eyes and face. The air against his raw, burned skin was both relief and torment. "Try not to move," Katherine instructed gently, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder to steady him. Her touch was professional, but there was something in it, a steadiness, a quiet strength that helped Matthew endure the procedure with gritted teeth rather than cries of pain. "The burns around your eyes are severe," Doc Sanders murmured, more to himself than to Matthew. "I'm going to apply a salve that should help with the healing and pain." The cool ointment was a blessed relief against Matthew's scorched skin, and he found himself releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You have a steady hand, Miss Prescott," he managed to say as her fingers gently applied the salve to the tender skin around his eyes. "Thank you," she replied, My father always said that was my greatest asset as a nurse. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, she said, and Matthew noted the past tense. Another loss, he thought, something they had in common. Fresh bandages were wrapped around his head, covering his eyes once more, and Matthew was left in the darkness that had become his world. The doctor explained that he would need to remain at the clinic for at least a week while the worst of his burns healed, and then they would reassess the situation with his eyes. Over the following days, Matthew came to recognize Katherine's presence by the subtle scent of lavender that accompanied her, by the particular cadence of her footsteps, and by the gentle but confident way she tended to his needs. She changed his bandages, helped him eat, and read to him from the local newspaper during the quiet afternoon hours when the clinic was less busy. It was during one of these reading sessions, 5 days after the fire, that Matthew first learned more about her. "You read very well," he commented as she finished an article about railroad expansion. "Your father made sure you were educated properly." "Yes," Katherine replied. "He believed women should be educated just as thoroughly as men, a rather progressive view for his time." "And your mother? Did she share his views?" A brief pause. "She died when I was very young. It was just my father and me until he passed," Matthew finished for her when she trailed off. "Yes, 2 years ago, influenza." "I'm sorry," Matthew said sincerely. "My parents are gone too. Father in 65, just after the war ended. Mother followed a year later." "The war took many, even those who never stepped onto a battlefield," Katherine observed quietly. "That it did," Matthew agreed. "After they died, there was nothing holding me in Pennsylvania. I headed west with what little money I had left after settling their debts and started the ranch." "You built it from nothing," Katherine said. "It wasn't a question but a statement of admiration." "And now I'm back to nothing," Matthew replied bitterly. "A blind rancher is about as useful as a 3-legged horse." "Is that what you think?" Katherine asked, her tone sharpening slightly. "That your value is only in what you can see with your eyes?" The question caught Matthew off guard. "A man needs his sight to work cattle, to mend fences, a man needs his knowledge, his experience, and his determination," Katherine interrupted. "Those things don't reside in your eyes, Mr. Irwin." Matthew gave a harsh laugh. "Try telling that to my foreman when I can't tell a heifer from a steer or read a brand." "There are many blind people who lead full, productive lives," Katherine insisted. "They adapt. They find new ways to do things." "Name one blind cattle rancher," Matthew challenged. Katherine was silent for a moment. "I can't," she finally admitted. "But that doesn't mean you can't be the first." "I appreciate your optimism, Miss Prescott, but you're being unrealistic. And you're giving up before you've even tried," she countered, her voice gentle but firm. "The bandages aren't even off yet, and you've already decided your life is over." Her words stung because there was truth in them. Matthew had indeed been wallowing in self-pity, seeing only what he had lost rather than what might still be possible. "I apologize," he said after a moment. "You're trying to be kind, and I'm being a poor patient." "You're being human," Katherine replied, her tone softening. "You've suffered a terrible loss, several losses, in fact. You're entitled to your anger and grief. But I won't let you surrender to it, Mr. Irwin." There was such quiet conviction in her voice that Matthew found himself wanting to believe her, even if just for a moment. "Matthew," he said, "if you're going to scold me like a schoolboy, you might as well use my Christian name." A light laugh, like a silver bell. "Very well, Matthew. And you may call me Katherine, at least when Doc Sanders isn't around to be scandalized by our informality." That brief exchange marked a turning point in their relationship. Over the next few days, as Matthew's burns began to heal, Katherine became not just his nurse but his confidante. She told him more about her life in Boston, how after her father's death, his medical practice had been sold to pay creditors, leaving her nearly destitute. She had come west at the invitation of her mother's cousin, who lived in Helena. "But I never made it to Helena," she explained one evening as she changed his bandages. "The stagecoach stopped here in Jerome, and I overheard Doc Sanders lamenting to the stagecoach driver about how overwhelmed he was with patients. I introduced myself, mentioned my nursing experience, and by the end of the day, I had a job and a room at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house." "Providence," Matthew suggested. "I like to think so," Katherine agreed, "though I suspect Doc Sanders thinks it was divine intervention. He'd been praying for help for months, apparently." "And now you're stuck caring for ornery burn patients," Matthew said wryly. "Just one particularly ornery burn patient," Katherine teased, securing the fresh bandage around his head, "though you've improved considerably in that regard." A week after the fire, Doc Sanders decided it was time to remove the bandages from Matthew's eyes permanently. The burns on his face had begun to heal, though the doctor warned there would be scarring, particularly around his eyes and across his left cheek and jaw. "Now, Matthew," the doctor said solemnly as he prepared to unwrap the bandages, "I want you to keep your expectations realistic. There's been significant damage to your eyes. If you can perceive light or shadows, that would be a positive sign, but don't expect miracles," Matthew finished for him. "I understand, Doc." Katherine stood nearby, and Matthew could sense her tension. She had become his most steadfast advocate, refusing to accept that his blindness was a certainty, searching medical texts for cases of recovery from similar injuries, and even writing to a specialist in St. Louis for advice. Slowly, carefully, Doc Sanders unwound the bandages. As the last layer came away, Matthew felt the air against his eyelids, still tender and healing. "Try opening your eyes very slowly," the doctor instructed. "The light may be painful at first." Matthew's heart pounded as he carefully attempted to open his eyes. The lids felt stiff and unnatural, and pain shot through them as he forced them apart. But it wasn't the pain that made his breath catch, it was the realization that came as his eyes opened fully. There was nothing. No light, no shadows, no shapes, only unrelenting darkness. "Matthew." Katherine's voice came from beside him, anxious and hopeful. "Can you see anything at all?" He wanted to lie for her sake more than his own, he realized, but he couldn't. "No," he said, his voice flat. "Nothing." The silence that followed was heavier than any Matthew had ever experienced. He heard Doc Sanders clear his throat uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, son," the doctor said. "As I mentioned, the damage was extensive. There's always a possibility that with time." But Matthew knew the doctor didn't believe his own words. This was his new reality, permanent darkness. "May I have a moment alone?" Matthew asked, his voice surprisingly steady despite the storm raging within him. "Of course," Doc Sanders replied quickly. "Katherine, let's give him some time." "I'll be just outside if you need anything," Katherine told him, and he heard the reluctance in her voice as she followed the doctor from the room. Alone in the darkness, Matthew finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loss. He'd been holding on to a thread of hope, however thin, that when the bandages came off, there would be something, a glimmer of light, vague shapes, anything. The absolute blackness that greeted him was a finality he hadn't been prepared for, despite the doctor's warnings. Hot tears burned tracks down his scarred cheeks, and Matthew didn't bother to wipe them away. What did it matter now? What did anything matter? He was 28 years old, in the prime of his life, and everything he had worked for, everything he had dreamed of, was now beyond his reach. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, drowning in despair, before a soft knock came at the door. "Matthew," It was Katherine. "May I come in?" He didn't answer, but she entered anyway, her footsteps hesitant on the wooden floor. "I brought you some tea," she said. "It has honey in it. Good for healing." "Thank you," Matthew replied automatically, though he made no move to take the cup she presumably held. Katherine sat down beside him. He could feel the slight dip of the mattress, smell the familiar lavender scent that he'd come to associate with comfort and care. "You're crying," she observed softly. "A man's entitled to tears when he loses everything," Matthew replied, not bothering to deny it. "Yes, he is," Katherine agreed. "But you haven't lost everything, Matthew." A harsh laugh escaped him. "No, my home is gone. My independence is gone. My livelihood—" "Your life isn't over," Katherine interrupted firmly. "You still have your land, your cattle, your men who respect you. You have your mind and your strength and your determination. You haven't lost those things." "What good are they to a blind man?" Matthew demanded. "Every bit as good as they are to a sighted one if you're willing to learn new ways of using them," Katherine insisted. Matthew shook his head, unconvinced. "You don't understand. A ranch requires eyes. How am I supposed to ride the range? How am I supposed to check fences or water holes or read brands or 100 other things that need doing?" "The same way blind people learn to do anything," Katherine replied. "With help at first, and then with adaptation." "I've never been one to rely on others," Matthew said stubbornly. "None of us are," Katherine said, "until circumstances force us to. Do you think I wanted to leave Boston and come west? Do you think I wanted to depend on the kindness of a distant relative I'd never met? Life rarely gives us what we want, Matthew. It gives us what we need to grow." Her words penetrated his cloud of misery, if only slightly. There was wisdom in them, and a kind of strength that had nothing to do with physical capability. "I don't know how to be this person," Matthew admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be blind." Katherine's hand found his, her fingers warm and steady as they entwined with his own. "Then I'll be the light you need," she said simply, "until you learn to navigate this darkness on your own." The unexpected declaration stole Matthew's breath away. In the short time he'd known her, Katherine had shown him nothing but kindness and care, but this was something more. This was a commitment, a promise he hadn't asked for and didn't deserve. "Why would you do that?" he asked, genuinely bewildered. "You hardly know me." "I know enough," Katherine replied. "I know you're a man who built something from nothing. I know you're stubborn and proud and sometimes irritatingly self-sufficient. And I know you're not the type of man who gives up, no matter what you might be feeling right now." "You have too much faith in me," Matthew said. "Perhaps," Katherine acknowledged, "or perhaps you have too little faith in yourself." She pressed the warm cup of tea into his hands, guiding his fingers to the handle. "Drink this. Then rest. Tomorrow we begin." "Begin what?" Matthew asked, taking an obedient sip of the sweet tea. "Your new life," Katherine said simply. "The one you're going to build, just as you built the old one with determination and hard work. Only this time you won't be doing it alone." True to her word, the next morning Katherine arrived at the clinic at dawn, carrying a bundle of what sounded like wooden sticks. "Canes," she explained when Matthew asked what she'd brought. "I had Mr. Hanson at the woodshop make several different lengths. We need to find which works best for you." "Canes," Matthew repeated, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. In his mind, canes were for old men, not for a cowboy in his prime. "Yes, canes," Katherine replied, apparently sensing his reluctance. "Tools, Matthew, nothing more, nothing less. A tool to help you move independently. Would you refuse a horse because it suggests you can't walk fast enough on your own?" Put that way, his resistance seemed foolish. "No, I suppose not." "Good. Now stand up. We'll try the longest one first." What followed was the first of many lessons. Katherine taught him how to use the cane to sweep the area in front of him, how to detect obstacles, how to judge distances by the sound of the cane's tip against different surfaces. They started in the small confines of his room at the clinic, then ventured into the hallway, and by afternoon, Katherine had him walking carefully around the entire first floor of the building. Each step was a small victory. Each new skill learned a tiny rebellion against the darkness that had claimed his world. And through it all, Katherine was there, patient, encouraging, but never pitying. The next day, they moved their lessons outdoors to the boardwalk in front of the clinic. The sounds and smells of Jerome assaulted Matthew's senses in a way they never had before. The clip-clop of horses' hooves, the chatter of passers-by, the sense of dust and manure and tobacco and cooking food, all of it seemed amplified, more immediate without sight to filter his perceptions. "People are staring," Matthew muttered as he tapped his way down the boardwalk, intensely aware of the hush that fell over conversations as they passed. "Let them stare," Katherine replied, her voice low but fierce. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." "I'm not ashamed," Matthew protested. "I just don't like being a spectacle." "Then give them something admirable to look at," Katherine challenged. "Show them your courage." Her words straightened his spine and lifted his chin. He continued down the boardwalk with more purpose, focusing on the task rather than the whispers that followed them. As the days passed, Matthew's skills improved. He learned to navigate the clinic and its immediate surroundings with growing confidence. Katherine taught him how to identify coins by feel, how to pour liquids without spilling by placing his finger just inside the rim of the cup, and dozens of other practical techniques for daily living. But the biggest test came 2 weeks after the fire, when Doc Sanders declared Matthew well enough to leave the clinic. The question of where he would go hung unspoken between them until Sheriff Taylor arrived with news. "Your foreman and hands have been busy, Matthew," the sheriff said as he settled into a chair by Matthew's bed. "They've cleared away the rubble from the house and barn, salvaged what they could, and started rebuilding the barn. Tim's been running things in your absence, keeping the cattle managed. They're a loyal bunch, your men." Matthew's throat tightened with emotion. He hadn't given much thought to his ranch since the fire, assuming it was as lost to him as his sight. The idea that his men had continued on, that they hadn't abandoned the rocking eye, stirred something inside him. "I should get back there," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "They need direction, and it's still my responsibility." "Are you sure you're ready?" Doc Sanders asked skeptically. "No," Matthew admitted, "but I won't get any more ready sitting here in town." "I'll go with him," Katherine said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "At least initially, to help him adjust to the new environment." Matthew opened his mouth to protest. Having her at the clinic was one thing, but having her come to his ranch, stay in his home, what was left of it, seemed far too intimate, too improper. But before he could voice these concerns, Sheriff Taylor spoke up. "That's a fine idea. Mrs. Wilson could go along as chaperone. She's been saying she needs a break from the boarding house anyway." And so it was decided. The next morning, Matthew found himself in a wagon beside Katherine and Mrs. Wilson, headed toward the Rocking Eye Ranch. The familiar rocking motion of the wagon and the sounds of the countryside stirred a mix of emotions in him: nostalgia, apprehension, and a strange sense of homecoming, despite knowing that home as he'd known it no longer existed. "There's a creek up ahead," Katherine narrated as they traveled. "I can see it winding through a meadow to the east. The grass is so green there, almost emerald compared to the drier pastures surrounding it." Matthew smiled, grateful for her descriptions. She had begun doing this during their walks in town, painting verbal pictures of their surroundings, giving him a way to see through her eyes. That's Willow Creek, he told her. Best water on the property. The cattle love grazing along its banks in summer. I can see why, Katherine replied. There are wildflowers growing along the edges, purple and yellow ones. Do you know what they are? The purple are likely prairie coneflowers, Matthew said, the image clear in his memory. The yellow would be black-eyed Susans. They bloom every year around this time. They're beautiful, Katherine said softly, like a painting. I remember, Matthew said, and was surprised to find the memory brought more comfort than pain. As they approached the ranch, Matthew heard his foreman's distinctive whistle before the man called out a greeting. Boss. Thank the Lord you're back. Tim's voice was a balm to Matthew's spirits. The older man had been with him since the beginning, hiring on when the Rocking Eye was nothing more than a ramshackle claim with a dozen head of cattle to its name. The wagon came to a stop and Matthew carefully climbed down, cane in hand. Tim, he said, extending his hand in the general direction of the foreman's voice. Good to be home. Tim's calloused hand clasped his firmly. Good to have you home. We've been doing our best to keep things running, but it ain't the same without you giving the orders. I hear you've already started rebuilding, Matthew said. Barn's coming along, Tim confirmed. Should be done in another week or so. We're living in the bunkhouse for now, but it's cramped. Figured we'd tackle the main house next, once you were back to tell us how you want it. Matthew swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the loyalty of his men. I appreciate that, Tim, more than I can say. Ah, well, Tim said, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion in Matthew's voice. We're just doing what needs doing. Now, who have you brought with you? Matthew made the introductions, explaining Katherine's role as his nurse and teacher. If Tim found anything unusual about the arrangement, he had the good sense not to mention it, especially with Mrs. Wilson standing right there, her expression daring anyone to imply impropriety. The next few weeks were among the most challenging of Matthew's life. Learning to navigate the familiar yet unfamiliar terrain of his own ranch tested his patience and determination daily. There were bumps and bruises, frustrations and setbacks, moments when he wanted nothing more than to give up and accept a life of dependency. But Katherine wouldn't let him. She was there every step of the way, teaching, encouraging, sometimes scolding when his self-pity threatened to overtake his progress. She taught him to use his other senses to identify his cattle by the sound of their movement, to judge the health of his pastures by their smell, to know his way around the property by the feel of the ground beneath his feet. The rebuilding of the barn was completed first, and work began on a new ranch house. Matthew insisted on being involved, feeling the plans that the carpenter drew up, running his hands over the framing as it went up, learning the layout by touch rather than sight. It's going to be even better than the original, Katherine told him one evening as they sat on makeshift benches near the construction site, listening to the ranch hands singing around the cook fire. Mrs. Wilson had retired early to her tent, leaving them alone but still within propriety's boundaries. I hope so, Matthew replied, though I would give anything to see it just once. I know, Katherine said softly. I wish I could give you that. You've given me more than I had any right to expect, Matthew said, reaching out to find her hand in the darkness that was now his constant companion. Without you, I'd still be wallowing in misery at the clinic or worse. Katherine's fingers entwined with his. You give me too much credit. The strength was in you all along. I just helped you find it again. Is that what you call all those stern lectures and merciless training sessions? Helping, Matthew teased, though there was truth behind his words. Katherine had never coddled him, never treated him as less capable because of his blindness. Katherine laughed, the sound as clear and refreshing as spring water. Someone had to keep you honest with yourself. True enough, Matthew acknowledged. Then, more seriously, Katherine, I've been thinking. Once the house is finished and I've gotten more accustomed to managing things here, you'll want to go back to your life in town. Katherine was quiet for a long moment. Is that what you think I want, isn't it? Matthew asked, genuinely uncertain. You have a position with Doc Sanders, a room at Mrs. Wilson's. You didn't sign on for a lifetime of guiding a blind rancher. No, Katherine agreed. I didn't, but plans change, people change. What are you saying? Matthew asked, hardly daring to hope that her words meant what he thought they might. Katherine's free hand came up to gently touch his face, her fingers tracing the healing scars with tender care. I'm saying that I've come to care for you, Matthew Irwin, more than I expected to. More than might be wise. Matthew's heart thundered in his chest. Katherine, you don't need to say anything, she interrupted. I know the timing is all wrong. You're still adjusting to your new life, still finding your way. I don't expect. It was Matthew's turn to interrupt, but not with words. Guided by the sound of her voice and the feel of her hand against his cheek, he leaned forward and found her lips with his own. The kiss was gentle, questioning at first, then deepening as Katherine responded, her hand sliding from his cheek to the nape of his neck. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Matthew kept his hand cupped around her cheek, unwilling to lose the connection between them. I've been wanting to do that for weeks, he confessed, but I didn't dare hope that you could feel the same way about a blind, scarred cowboy with an uncertain future. Oh, Matthew, Katherine sighed, leaning her forehead against his. Don't you understand yet? Your blindness doesn't define you. Your scars don't diminish you. They're just part of the man you are, the man I've come to love. The word love hung between them, as profound and powerful as a prayer. Matthew's thumb traced the curve of her cheek, memorizing its contour by touch as he once might have by sight. I love you too, he said, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised even him. I think I've loved you since you first told me you'd be the light I needed. And I meant it, Katherine whispered. I still do. But I don't want you to be my nurse or my guide forever, Matthew said. That's not a life for you. No, Katherine agreed, but being your wife might be. Matthew's breath caught. Katherine Prescott, are you proposing to me? A small laugh, embarrassed but not regretful. I suppose I am. How terribly forward of me. Terribly, Matthew agreed, smiling. But since you've taken my traditional role, I suppose I'll have to take yours and accept with maidenly delight. Their shared laughter filled the night air, a sound of pure joy that drew curious glances from the ranch hands around the cookfire. Is that a yes, then? Katherine asked when their mirth subsided. It's a yes, Matthew confirmed, finding her lips again for another kiss. On one condition. Which is? That you understand what you're getting into, Matthew said seriously. Life with me won't always be easy. I'm still learning, still adapting. There will be challenges we can't even anticipate yet. Life is never easy, Katherine replied. But it's better when shared with someone you love. I know what I'm choosing, Matthew. I choose you, all of you, just as you are. The new house was completed by early autumn, a sturdy two-story structure built to Matthew's specifications. Every detail was designed with his needs in mind, consistent spacing between furniture, textured markers at key points to help with orientation, a place for everything and everything in its place, so he could find what he needed without assistance. Their wedding was a small affair, held on the ranch with Doc Sanders officiating and the entire population of the Rocking Eye in attendance. Sheriff Taylor gave the bride away, and Mrs. Wilson wept happy tears as the couple exchanged vows beneath an arch of autumn foliage that Katherine later described to Matthew in exquisite detail. Life settled into a rhythm different from what Matthew had envisioned for himself, but no less fulfilling. Katherine proved to be not only his wife but his partner in every sense, learning the cattle business alongside him, keeping the ranch accounts, reading correspondence and cattle market reports aloud each evening. Together, they developed new systems for managing the ranch, adapting traditional methods to accommodate Matthew's blindness. Tim and the other hands, initially skeptical that a blind man could run a successful ranch, became converts to Matthew and Katherine's methods. They learned to report verbally what they once would have shown visually, to describe conditions rather than expect Matthew to see them for himself. In return, Matthew's other senses became so finely tuned that he could often identify problems with cattle by sound or smell before they became visible to the eye. The rocking eye not only survived but thrived. Within 2 years, they had expanded their herd and purchased additional grazing land to the north. Matthew became known throughout the territory not as that blind rancher, but as a shrewd businessman with an uncanny ability to judge cattle by touch and sound. Katherine, meanwhile, continued to use her nursing skills, becoming the unofficial medic for the ranch and surrounding homesteads. She delivered babies, treated injuries, and dispensed medicines and advice with the same calm competence she had shown in helping Matthew adjust to his blindness. On a warm spring evening in 1879, almost 3 years after the fire that had changed everything, Matthew sat on the porch of their home, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Katherine's footsteps approached from inside the house, and he smiled in anticipation of her company. "The little one is finally asleep," she said, as she settled beside him on the porch swing. Their daughter, Elizabeth, born just 6 months earlier, had proven to have her father's stubborn streak, and her mother's determination a combination that made bedtime a challenge. "She fights sleep like it's a mortal enemy," Matthew observed with a chuckle, slipping his arm around Katherine's shoulders and drawing her close. "Wonder who she gets that from," Katherine teased, nestling against him. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, the creaking of the porch swing and the distant lowing of cattle the only sounds disturbing the peace of the evening. "You ever regret it?" Matthew asked suddenly. "Tying yourself to a blind rancher, taking on all the extra work that comes with it?" It was a question he rarely allowed himself to voice, though it sometimes haunted him in quieter moments. Katherine's answer was immediate and emphatic. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Even when you have to describe every sunset to me. Even when you have to read every letter twice, because I've forgotten what the first part said by the time you reach the end." Katherine shifted in his arms, turning to face him though he couldn't see her. She took his hands in hers, a gesture that had become her way of ensuring he knew she was speaking from the heart. "Matthew Irwin, I have never considered any of those things burdens. They're privileges. Do you know how many people go through life never really seeing a sunset, even with perfect vision? I see them more clearly now, because I see them through your need to understand. I notice details I would have missed before." Matthew squeezed her hands gently, overwhelmed as always by her capacity for finding meaning and beauty in circumstances others might consider tragic. "Besides," Katherine continued, a smile in her voice, "you've given me far more than I've ever given you. A home, a family, a purpose. And you've shown me what real courage looks like every day." "I don't feel particularly courageous," Matthew admitted. "I just do what needs doing." "That's exactly what courage is," Katherine insisted. "Doing what needs doing even when it's difficult, even when you're afraid." Matthew pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair and breathing in the familiar lavender scent that had come to mean home to him more than any place ever could. "I love you, Katherine Irwin," he murmured, "more than I have words to say." "And I love you," she replied, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw, her touch as tender as it had been the first time she'd tended his burns. "My stubborn, proud, impossibly determined cowboy." Inside the house, baby Elizabeth began to cry, her wails carrying clearly through the open window. "Speaking of stubborn," Katherine sighed, making to rise. "I'll get her," Matthew said, standing and helping Katherine to her feet as well. "You've been on your feet all day with her." "Are you sure?" "Completely," Matthew replied with confidence. "I've mapped every inch of that nursery in my mind. I can find our daughter in the dark as well as you can." Katherine laughed. "That's true enough. Very well, I'll wait here for my two favorite people." Matthew made his way into the house and up the stairs, his cane unnecessary in the home he knew by heart. Following the sound of Elizabeth's increasingly insistent cries, he entered the nursery and went directly to the cradle. "There now, little one," he murmured, reaching down to lift his daughter with practiced care. "What's all this fuss about him?" The baby's cries softened as she recognized her father's voice and touch. Matthew cradled her against his chest, his large hand supporting her tiny head as he began to sway gently, humming a lullaby his own mother had sung to him long ago. As Elizabeth quieted, Matthew carried her to the rocking chair by the window. Sitting down, he continued to rock and hum, marveling at the miracle of the tiny life in his arms. He couldn't see his daughter's face, but he knew every detail of it by touch: the softness of her cheeks, the perfect bow of her lips, the delicate sweep of eyelashes against his fingertips when she blinked sleepily. Eventually, Katherine's footsteps sounded on the stairs and in the hallway. She paused at the nursery door, and Matthew could picture her leaning against the doorframe, watching them. "She's almost asleep again," he said softly. "You have the magic touch," Katherine replied, her voice equally quiet as she moved into the room to join them. "She knows her father's love, even in the dark." "Especially in the dark," Matthew corrected gently. "That's where love matters most, isn't it? When we can't see our way forward, when the future is uncertain, that's when knowing someone is there, holding on to us, makes all the difference." Katherine's hand came to rest on his shoulder, a touch as familiar and essential to him now as breathing. "Yes," she agreed. "That's exactly when it matters most." As their daughter drifted back to sleep in his arms, Matthew reflected on the journey that had brought him here from the devastating fire that had taken his sight to this moment of perfect contentment. He had lost so much that night 3 years ago, but what he had gained since then was beyond measure. The darkness that had once seemed like an ending had become, instead, the beginning of a different kind of sight, one that showed him what truly mattered in life. With Katherine's love as his light and his own determination as his strength, Matthew had built not just a new home but a new way of living, one day at a time. And in that moment, cradling his sleeping child with his wife by his side, Matthew knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't trade this life, this hard one, beautifully imperfect life, for anything in the world, not even for the return of his sight. For he had learned what Katherine had tried to tell him from the beginning, that the most important things in life were never seen with the eyes at all but with the heart, and his heart, at last, was full.